So this is a Jeep CJ7 that belongs to a friend of mine, and he asked me to do some work on it. He told me it was a 76, but one of the things I looked into was the gas tank, which was full of crud. And I looked at the gas tanks for it, and the gas tank appears to be from a 78. I don't know if this is a 78. It is a Jeep that a previous owner to him had put a fiberglass body on it, so can't really look up the VIN number or anything like that. At least I haven't been able to find it. So one of the things that he asked me to do was to replace the tie rod end. Okay. And I've done that already, but there's something I wanted to point out here in case you ever do tie rod ends with this type of Jeep. When I disconnected the old one and the tie rod dropped down, it wouldn't drop far enough to get the stud out of the steering knuckle because the spring there was in the way, and I don't know, I was pointing to it, you probably may not have seen it, but that spring is in the way and it doesn't allow that tie rod to drop down far enough to get that stud out of the steering knuckle. And what I found is if you turn the wheel to the direction to the side that the tie rod end you're trying to replace is on, that the steering geometry changes and it does give you enough clearance to drop that out of there. So that's a point worth mentioning. Another thing I discovered, he didn't ask me to actually do it, but when I was looking at all the components in the Jeep here, the steering damper or steering stabilizer is probably its true name, was completely dead. It was doing absolutely nothing. And one of the things that I rely on YouTube to see how to do some things before I even attempt them a lot of times. And I looked on YouTube and I was trying to find out, how do you determine where to put that bracket? That bracket goes on the front end of the steering stabilizer, and then the back end of it attaches up above the spring there, and I can almost probably point to it with this. Right there's a stud sticking up, and that stud can't be removed without dropping the spring because the head of it runs into the spring long before you'd be anywhere close to getting it out. So I'm going to have to reuse that old stud. But one of the things I noticed, and again, I don't know who did what to this Jeep because, like I said, he didn't do it, but that bracket, and it's hard to see here, but the part where the end of this stabilizer bolts into is right here. I don't know if you can see that, but on all the videos that I had seen, and nobody told you how to set this thing up when you are installing it, because most of the ones don't have this bracket here that actually slides, and the ones that do hadn't removed this, and I removed it because this U-bolt that holds it on was broken. I was going to get a new one but couldn't find one, so I welded it. But at any rate, most of them have this reversed so that this, where the stabilizer bolts into, is here, but it's twisted this way so that the bolts that hold the bracket on are over here where you can actually get to them easier with the stabilizer in place, because the way this is now, the stabilizer's a little bit in the way of where you need to be to get your wrench on it. So what I had assumed long before I actually found it online is that if you had the wheels straight, this stabilizer needs to be halfway extended, because if it gets fully extended, it's going to limit your travel in one direction. If it's fully compressed, it's going to limit your travel in the other direction. So this needs to be halfway. So I am going to go and measure how far. And what's nice about these is, unlike a shock, it doesn't tend to want to expand by itself or even contract by itself. So I'm going to pull it all the way out. I'm going to measure it. Then I'm going to set it to halfway to determine where to mount this bracket. And I'm going to reverse this so that the mounting point is in about the same place, but the 2 U-bolts that hold it on will be over here, and at least one of those will have a lot more clearance for bolting it on. But this is what's going to end up. So I'll have to measure the extension on this thing. So the extension on it total was 6 3/4 inches. So half of that is 3 3/8. So now that's where I want it to be, at the center of the steering with the wheels pointed straight ahead. So I'm going to remove that mounting bracket and get it attached to the front of this and get ready to install it. So here we have it with the mounting bracket on. Just gonna try and keep this from moving while I put it on the stud over here. And I bolt it up to the tie rod. And I will get in here before I make the final adjustment and remeasure that. They have this plate in the back here that grips it on the tie rod, and that thing is a little bit difficult to deal with because you need 3 hands, and you probably didn't even see it because I probably had my hand in the way. Need to get rid of the gloves. Can't get in there with enough dexterity. Put them on. That's actually not a whole lot better turning the thing this way because you got that rubber bushing from the shock mount in the way. get rid of this thing that holds it on until I get it loosely attached. It'll be better. It's always fun dealing with things that you can't reach. Okay, got one on. There's little spacers in there that go on before the nuts on this U-bolt, so they're a little bit difficult to deal with. Okay, those are both started. Now it's probably a good time to put this spacer in here. If I have to get it under both of those U-bolts at the same time, that's probably not going to be easy. Top one first, that's a little longer. These U-bolts were rusty, so after I took them off, I did run a tap through the nuts and a bolt, or a die on the studs so that I'd be sure they'd be easier to thread. It's a darn good thing I did, because that isn't the easiest thing. Okay. Before I tighten that down good, I'm going to check that spacing on that ram, make sure that it's good. Moved just a hair. Hard to get anything in there to measure with. And that's about as good as I can measure it. So that'll hold it in place for the time being. And now I can put the washer and nut up on this stud here on the other end. I did run the tap and die on those too, so that I'd be sure that I could get it back on good. There it is. Okay, so that is pretty much it, except for the final tightening of these things. So instead of having you watch me just do this slow wrenching and turn off the camera. And I'll be back in a bit once that's tightened to explain some of the other stuff that I did on this project. So it's all bolted on, and the only thing left to do is to go, I'm going to climb on a step ladder and turn the wheels in each direction, make sure that it goes okay. And I'm actually, instead of climbing down off the step ladder, I will use the video to confirm that it's actually working right. I do have the wheels on turntables for alignment so that I can do this. That's locked to the left. And lock to the right. So as you can see, by lining that up in the middle, it allows you to turn in both directions. If you had that compressed or fully extended, you wouldn't be able to turn in one direction. So that's a wrap on that. I'll just go over a couple of the other things that I've done on this Jeep, because I said many times that the person who wired it was an electrical engineer, and apparently based on the fact that they had that bracket on the wrong way as well, maybe they weren't a mechanic either. One of the things I did do was took apart and adjusted the worn hubs for selecting two-wheel drive and four-wheel drive. I'll talk about that in a little bit. So the hubs on this, neither one of them was working. The one on the passenger side wouldn't turn at all. This is how you select two versus four-wheel. It's still hard to turn in spite of the fact that I did take it apart and grease it and clean it. It's still hard to get it started. Once you get it moving, it's okay. So this one was so corroded and full of what might have been mud or something that it wouldn't turn at all. So I took it apart, cleaned it all out, and put it back together. It still wasn't quite right on my first try because of something that nobody ever mentioned on any of the ones I saw on YouTube. The way that works is when you turn that handle or that selector, you are turning a threaded cam in there that as you turn it towards four wheel, it's pushing out on a piston, I'll call it. It's not really a piston because there's no hydraulics, but a round thing that is in splines so that it doesn't turn. So as you turn this, that moves forward. And what that does is pushes against a splined, it's not exactly a gear, it's just a splined piece of metal that goes in, and the splines interact with splines that are on the axle. And that means that the wheel then is connected to the drive shaft. As you turn it back towards two-wheel drive, you're retracting that and those splines no longer line up, so the drive shaft could spin without the wheel, or the wheel could spin without the drive shaft. And basically, when I put it together the first time, I didn't have that adjustment quite right, and it was just engaging enough of those splines to make it locked all the time. So what I did is I took it back apart and I actually measured how far you needed to have clearance for that spline inside to actually engage the axle. And then I adjusted, there's a little threaded piece in there. I adjusted that so that whenever I had it in two-wheel drive, it backed it off far enough so that that spline could completely disengage with the axle. The other side, apparently somebody took it apart and put it together and didn't put it together right, because there's a fine line between having that adjusted, because the thing that it screws into is only about 1/8 of an inch thick, and it's easy to, if you don't have that adjustment quite right, when you back it off to two-wheel drive or put it into four-wheel drive, it can go either way. The threads in the thing that you're turning actually disengage from what it's threaded into, and that's what the problem was on the other side. The selector would just continuously turn and never change it. So I guess it was always in two-wheel drive with that. But that one I took apart after fooling with the first one. I did that one in about 10 minutes. It was easy. There's when you take this hub off, it all comes off as one assembly. There's a screw right in the middle of there, Phillips screw, that connects this thing that you rotate to the inner threaded bushing, I'll call it, that pushes the piece of plastic that then pushes the splined gear on and off of the axle. So it's kind of easy to take it apart. It's a little harder to put it back together because there's a big spring in there and you have to compress that. What I did is I took it and I set it on top of a socket that fit inside that and just pressed down on it. Was able to get it in that way. So I got those working for him. So as he was driving this over here to have me work on it, he ran out of gas. Put a little more in it. In the meantime, he, for some reason, disconnected the fuel filter or something and pumped some gas through it. Found out it was almost chocolate brown. It was really bad. So the gas gauge didn't work. That's why he ran out of gas. And I looked at the wiring diagram, which you can almost read because it's so small. It looked like there were 3 terminals on the gas gauge. One to provide power to the gas gauge, another to take that power and send it back to the sending unit, which grounds out using a resistor to tell the gas gauge how much to register. And the third is a ground for the gauge itself that can be grounded anywhere. So when I looked at the wiring diagram, there were in fact 3 screws at the back of it. And I thought that, well, I didn't know which was which. This diagram was hard to see. I shouldn't say I didn't know which was which. I knew which terminal was which, but they had a wire connected to one of them of three. And based on everything I'd seen in the wiring of the Jeep, I had no confidence that it was wired correctly. So I decided the best way to find out what was going on was to drop the gas tank and then do a continuity test between that wire and the wire up on the gauge. I just got a bunch of connectors to my own meter and did that, and it turned out that was in fact the wire that should have been connected to the sending unit as it was. And it isn't clear on this because it's so small on this wiring diagram, but there was no power going to the gas gauge and there was no ground wire on it anywhere. Well, it turns out that if you're getting a standalone gas gauge, you're going to have to ground it. This one was built into, you probably can't see it here, but it was built into the gauge cluster, and it grounded through the gauge cluster, so that third terminal was a shunt to provide power over to the temperature gauge. So it wasn't really for a ground. You only needed to connect two wires to it. You needed a hot from the ignition source, and you needed a wire coming back to the sending unit. Well, it was a good thing that I decided to drop the tank because when I dumped it out, that gasoline in there was nasty, and there was all kind of crud in the tank. And so I called the guy and talked to him, asked him if he wanted me to try to pressure wash this one out or get a new one. And in the meantime, I'd gotten a price on a new one, and I found out that these connectors for the fuel filler in the vent actually match the tank from a 78 CJ. So I don't know whether this is a 78 or whether it's a 76 with some 78 parts or whatever. So we got that all cleaned out. The sending unit that was in there was so full of crud that I've got another one on order. That's why the gas tank isn't in yet. I'll be putting that in probably sometime next week once I get it. And that'll be the rest of the project. So another thing that wasn't working is the windshield wiper. They had just cut off wires at about here. 3 wires were hanging down. And when I investigated the wiper switch, which wasn't working, whoever did the body swap, I guess, just chopped off these connectors, these wires at the connector that goes into the back of the light switch. I'm sorry, the windshield wiper switch. And the reason I'm pointing this out is I always make it a habit that I leave a couple inches of wire on any connector that I need to maybe reuse so that I can connect something to it. This is impossible to work with. And so I'm not going to tell you how I did it, but I wired up a switch that was basically from a 3-way lamp, and you turn it to the first, you get slow. That's first. And you get two fast speeds. Okay, you start with slow. That went off. And there's fast. Another off. Anyway, I'm not going to tell you how I wired that because I don't want to have anybody try to do it, catch their Jeep on fire and get mad at me. Another thing I did is the voltmeter, and this is part of the reason why I say the person that did the wiring wasn't an electrical engineer, because they had it wired to a wire that was hot all the time, so it was causing a battery drain. I don't know whether they realized it or not, but it was dead anyways, probably because it was running continuously for maybe years or trying to run continuously. So what I did is find a wire that's hooked up to the ignition, and I'm climbing up a ladder here to get in here. Found a wire hooked up to the ignition, and let's see if I can zoom in on it. So now I put in a digital voltmeter. I can't start the car because I don't have a gas tank on it, so it's only showing you what the battery has. And the fuel gauge, once I did everything, it's not going to register anything now because it's disconnected, but when I had it connected, it did register, and it appeared to be reasonably accurate. The other thing that I did, and I'm not going to show it because I don't want to have to lower the Jeep or off the lift because I'm getting ready to park a car under it. But the wiring inside the engine compartment, there was some black tape on some of it, but there were a lot of wires that were just individual wires hanging out in space with house wiring, wire nuts twisted on to some of them. I basically soldered that and used shrink wrap on all that so that the connections are good and will remain good. And I put the wires into a plastic wire loom for them so that it looks a lot neater under there, and that protect them from the elements and everything. And another thing that they didn't do is, this is a points ignition, so there should have been a wire from the solenoid to the plus side of the coil that provides 12 volts when you're cranking the engine, and then there should have been a wire with a resistor or a resistor wire to provide a lower voltage when it's running, and that makes your points in your coil last longer. So I happen to have an old resistor I had taken off of a vehicle that I converted to a HEI ignition, and I put that on there for him. So I think he's got a vehicle that is at least serviceable now, and I think he'll be happy with the results.